Have you heard of one Humpty Dumpty? How he fell with a roll and a rumble, and fell off like a doll of a crumple by the butt of the magazine wall.
Welcome to James Joyce's divine and delirious comedy, Finnegans Wake. In this episode, number 7, we'll hear Irish-Canadian actor and my good friend and colleague Richard Harte reading pages 30 to 34 to begin Chapter 2 of Joyce's last novel. I'm Adam Seelig, the director of the reading you'll soon hear. Finnegans Wake is a production of One Little Goat Theatre Company. For the next 5 years, One Little Goat will film and record all 17 chapters, roughly 30 hours, of Joyce's Finnegans Wake before live audiences in various locations, screening and releasing them along the way with the aim of completing the entire book in time for its 90th birthday, May the 4th of 2029. One Little Goat Theatre Company is an official charity in Canada and the United States. If you'd like to support our work, please visit us online at www.onelittlegoat.org to make a charitable donation. And if monetary support is not an option, you can still help this podcast by rating and reviewing it and by spreading the word. To get in touch, you'll find our email address on the One Little Goat Theatre Company website, and we'd love to hear from you. I'm happy to be back after a short break spent on film production for future chapters of Finnegans Wake. If you're only joining us now, welcome and no worries. Finnegans Wake is a non-linear novel after all, so beginning at Chapter 2 is as good a place as any. And as I've been saying in nearly every episode, feel free to jump ahead to Richard's reading if you'd rather skip my introduction. In the previous podcast episode, Richard Harte concluded his reading of Chapter 1, which served as an overture sounding out the novel's main themes, especially the theme of humanity's cyclical and comical fall and rise and fall again, our funereal wake at which we awaken like Tim Finnegan of the Irish-American folk song, who is both Finn and again, a person who ends and begins repeatedly. Chapter 2 introduces us to the novel's protagonist, who goes by the initials HCE and the moniker Earwicker among his many other names and nicknames. The chapter opens with an origin story for Earwicker's name and a further exploration and confusion of his numerous names and identities. That's because H.C. Earwicker is the furthest thing from a conventional character in a work of fiction, but rather an entity who contains multifarious multitudes. He is, it turns, Adam, the Hebrew Bible's original man, Tim Finnegan of folksong fame, the barkeeper at the Mullingar Inn in Chapelizod, Dublin, who goes by the family name Porter, and many other identities. His characterlessness, as I described Mutt and Jute in episode 4, enables him to shift into many shapes and morph into many molds. So for Chapter 2 to pursue the genesis of HCE's name, to ask essentially who is Earwicker, is a lot like asking who was Homer, the ancient Greek bard about whom we know little by way of concrete biographical facts and whose epic poems, the Odyssey and the Iliad, influenced the contours and contents of Joyce's two epics, Ulysses and Finnegans Wake. When Emily Wilson, in her introduction to her brilliant new translation of the Iliad, describes the conjecture surrounding Homer's identity, I'm reminded of the Wake's search for earwickers. Here's Wilson on Homer. Quote, how, where, when exactly, and by whom the poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were made, we do not know. Maybe an oral poet or several such poets became literate. Maybe an illiterate or semi-literate poet or group of poets collaborated with one or more scribes, perhaps using dictation. Perhaps one great composer was named Homer, a name that was associated in antiquity with the word for hostage, Homeros, although various other speculative etymologies were also posited. The composer may have been a blind man who came from rocky Chios, as the narrator of the hymn to Delian Apollo asserts, although this was only one of numerous rival local legends about this most elusive of poets. Every statement about the historical person or people who composed the Iliad must be hedged with maybes. Ancient lives of Homer are set in the cloudy lands of biographical myth. Close quote. Chapter 2 of Finnegans Wake begins in such a land of biographical myth, where every statement about Earwicker must be hedged with maybes. The myth in this case is that HCE, or Harold, or Humphrey, or whatever his name may be, was out gardening one Sabbath afternoon when royalty approached on horseback. His Majesty wants to know what caused all the potholes in the road, but through a misunderstood exchange, the nervous, subservient HCE, who is merely a vassal, tells His Highness that he was catching some earwigs. As a result, the name of Earwigger or Earwicker has stuck to the man ever since. As with every word in the wake, Earwicker can connote many things, including a character whose ears are particularly receptive, wicking up his auditory surroundings, or an entomological character like his near namesake, the earwig. And if there is something insect-like about him, perhaps there's also something insectuous, or, as novelist Anthony Burgess has suggested with the swap of two letters, something incestuous within this character. Or given his many identities, HCE, as you'll soon hear in Chapter 2, could stand for Here Comes Everybody, with Earwicker representing humanity, all of us. Or if we hear earwigging as older English slang for eavesdropping, and the expression is still, if rarely, used today, then Earwicker's name itself presents the main subject of Chapter 2, and that is gossip, slander. On page 32, after suggesting that HCE could signify Here Comes Everybody, the Wake's wonderfully associative dream language riffs and runs on theatrical, hyped-up language full of play and dramatics, with all the world, for a moment, a stage, or, quote, world stage. And then on page 33, the ear-wigging, i.e. gossiping and slander, associated with the name and character of Earwicker begins to emerge. As the text puts it, quote, a baser meaning has been read into HCE's name. And what's all this gossip, you may want to know, or spill the tea, as my kids like to say? It may be hazy, as rumors tend to be, but it seems to involve 3 Welsh soldiers, 2 girls peeing in the rushes of Dublin's Phoenix Park, and a threatening cad whom we'll meet later in this chapter. It's worth noting that these 3 elements, comprised of the 3 soldiers, 2 girls, and 1 cad, will become a recurring motif throughout Finnegans' Wake, represented by the numbers 3, 2, and 1. At the suggestion of this gossip on page 33, the text seems to grow defensive on behalf of Earwicker. Quote, the mere suggestion of H.C. Earwicker as a lust sleuth nosing for trouble in a booby trap rings particularly preposterous, close quote. Perhaps the text here protests too much. And by page 34, it denounces all this hearsay even more forcefully as, quote, slander. But of course, the juicier the details and the more emphatically they're denied, the more they pique our interest. And indeed, there's more gossip to come in Chapter 2. This is just the beginning. Before we get to Richard's reading, I want to point out another motif that figures throughout the novel, which you'll hear on the opening page of Chapter 2, and that's the motif of characters getting dressed in 7 items of clothing. It's always 7. In this chapter, it happens when Earwicker dresses hurriedly, though arguably horridly, in order to see His Majesty, who has arrived nearby on horseback. In Chapter 1, this motif of dressing to the sevens, so to speak, occurs near the climax of the Prank Queen fable, Episode 5 of our podcast series, when Jarl von Huther girds up his loins to put an end, he hopes, to the Prank Queen's disruptive antics. The 7 items may sound strange in the dream language of the Wake, but a close listening/reading will reveal the Jarl's 7 items, beginning with his, quote, broad ginger hat, close quote, and ending with his, quote, fur-framed pununcular cumbots, close quote, which I hear as gumboots. Here's an excerpt of Richard reading that moment.
For like the Campbells are coming with a forked lance of lightning, Jarl van Huther born urges himself, the whole terror of the Dames came hip up and yap, out through the pike open archway of his 3 shutting castles, in his broad ginger hat, and his civic challar, and his alabuff hemmed, and his bull bragging socks and gloves, and his ladbroke breeks, and his catgut bandolier, and his 4-frame penuncular cummels like a rod yelling blue-green orangeman, and his violent indogination.
And here's another example from earlier in Chapter 1 in the Musie Room, Episode 3 of our podcast. When Kate describes the Duke of Wellington on horseback, Kate calls him Willingdon in this Wakian War Museum, listing 7 items on his person, from his golden spurs to his, quote, war trews, close quote, or war trousers. This is Richard reading that moment.
This is the Willingdon on his same white horse, the coke and hape. This is the big swart of Willingdon, grand and magentic in his gold tin spurs, and his iron ducks, and his quarter-brass woody shoes, and his magnate's garters, and his Bangkok's best, and his Goliath's galoshes, and his pull-upon easy on war trews. This is his big white horse. Tip.
I opened with Emily Wilson's comments on the Iliad, and I'm going to close with an excerpt from her translation because this dressed to the sevens motif of Finnegans Wake is very much in the epic tradition of Homer, whoever that may have been. Just listen to how closely this epic description of Agamemnon dressing for battle, composed nearly 3,000 years ago, establishes the template and even partly the tone in its fastidious specificity for Joyce's comic spin on the clothing and gear his characters would wear. Quote, Then Agamemnon, the son of Atreus, addressed the Greeks, shouting that all of them must arm themselves, and he himself put on his shining bronze. He strapped fine greaves around his lower legs, fitted with silver shin guards. Next he fastened onto his chest the corselet that Cinyras had given him to seal their bond of friendship when the important news had come to Cyprus that Greeks were sailing in their ships to Troy. Cinyras gave this gift to Agamemnon the leader, in the hope of winning favor. It had 10 stripes of dark blue-black enamel, and 12 of gold, and 20 made of tin. And 3 dark snakes coiled up towards the neck on either side, like rainbows, which the son of Cronus sets in clouds as signs for humans. Across his shoulders, Agamemnon strapped his sword, all shimmering with golden studs, held in a silver scabbard, which was set with golden rings. Then he picked up his shield, a splendid, deadly shield, strong on both sides, adorned with many splendid decorations. Around it ran 10 circles made of bronze, and it had 10 white bosses made of tin, and one of blue enamel at the center. The middle garland was a glaring gorgon, whose gaze was terrifying, and around her panic and fear. The strap was made of silver, and round it coiled a blue snake with 3 faces, each turning different ways, grown from one neck. Then Agamemnon put onto his head his leather helmet, which had 2 bronze plates, 4 bosses, and a horsehair crest. The plume nodded ferociously right at the top. Last, he picked up 2 warlike sharp spears, tipped with bronze, whose gleam shone far into the sky. Close quote. I know it's not a competition, but Homer may have out-epiced Joyce on this one. Richard Harte's reading of Finnegans Wake Chapter 2 was shot and recorded in Toronto at Noonan's Irish Pub on June 26, 2023, with a live audience. The film premiered at the Toronto Irish Film Festival and Bloomsday Film Festival at the James Joyce Centre in Dublin. Now it's time to welcome you to Noonan's Irish Pub for Richard's reading of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake, page 30, line 1 to page 34, line 29, for the beginning of Chapter 2.
Now, to forbear for ever so little of iris trees and lily oragans, concerning the genesis of Harold or Humphrey Chimpton's occupational agnomen, we are back in the pre-surnames prodromerith period. Of course, just when Enos chalked hot traps, and discarding once for all those theories from older sources which would link him back with such pivotal ancestors as the Glues, the Gravies, the Northeasts, the Anchors, and the Ear Wickers of Sidless Sham and the 100 of manhood. or proclaim him offsprout of Vikings who had founded Wapentake and settled him in Herrick or Eric. The best authenticated version, the Dumnat, read the reading of Hafid ben Adar, has it that it was this way. We are told how in the beginning it came to pass that like cabbaging Cincinnatus, the grand old gardener was saving daylight under his redwood tree one sultry Sabbath afternoon, hag Chivichas Eve, in pre-fall paradise peace, by following his plough for rootles in the rare garden of Mob House, the old Marine Hotel, when royalty was announced by runner to have been pleased to have halted itself on the high road, along which a leisure-loving dog-fox had cast fault, also at walking pace, by a lady pack of cocker spaniels. Forgetful of all save his vassal's plain fealty to the ethnarch, Humphrey or Harold stayed not to yoke or saddle, but stumbled out, hot-faced as he was, his sweatful bandana loose from his pocket coat, hastening to the forecourts of his public in toupee, sore singles, solus scarf and plaid +4s, puttees and bulldog boots ruddled cinnabar with flagrant marl, jingling his turnpike keys, and bearing aloft amid the fixed pikes of the hunting party, a high perch atop of which a flower pot was fixed, earthside hoist with care. On his Majesty, who was, or often feigned to be, noticeably long-sighted from green youth, and had been meaning to inquire what, in effect, had caused yon causeway to be thus potholed, asking substitutionally to be put wise as to whether paternoster and silver doctors were not now more fancy bait for lobster trapping. Honest, blunt Harumphrield answered in no uncertain tones, very similarly, with a fearless forehead, "Aye, your naggers, we're just a cotton on none bluggy earwuggers." Our sailor king, who was draining a guglet of obvious Adam ale, gift both and gorban. Upon this, ceasing to swallow, smiled most heartily beneath his walrus moustaches, and indulging that none too genial humour which William the Conk on the spindle side had inherited, with the hereditary whitelock and some short-fingeredness from his great-aunt Sophie, turned towards two of his retinue of gallow glasses, Michael, Etheling Lord of Leeks and Offaly, and the Jubilee Mayor of Drogheda, L. Cock, the two scatterguns being Michael M. Manning, Protosyndic of Waterford, and an Italian excellency named Jubilee, according to a later version cited by the learned scholar Canavan of Can Make Noise. In either case, a triptychal religious family, symbolising puritas of doctrina, business per usuals, and the porty patch of Hamlock where the paddish pretties grow, and remarked dulcely, "Holy bones of St. Hubert, how our red brother of Porin Grania would audibly fume did he know that we have a Sir Trusty bailiwick, a turnpiker who is by turns a pike bailer, no seldomer than an earwigger. For he can jump hill with his court so grey, and his haunts in the house in the morning. One still hears that pebble-crusted laughter, jappy-jap, cheery-cheery, among the roadside tree the lady home Patrick planted. Still one feels the emossive silence of the clad stone, alleged belling, "I've my outside born." Comes the question, are these the facts of his nomine gentilization as recorded and accoladed in both or either of the collateral anthropomorphic narratives? Are those their fata which we read in Sibylline between the Fas and its nefas? No dung on the road? And shall Nohomaya be our place like Molochi our king of Ilkan? We shall perhaps not so soon see. Pink ponk that bear for seeks a license where conceptors with centaurs stay. Bear in mind, son of Hochma, if so be you have method in your midness, this man is mountain, and unto changes doth one ascend. Heave we aside the fallacy, as punicle as finikin, that it was not the king self, but his inseparable sisters, uncontrollable night-talkers, skirts the rays with Donya's egg, who afterwards, when the robbers shut up the socialites, came down into the world as amusers, and were staged by Madame Sudlow as Rosa and Lily Miskinget in the pantomime that two pits patronised Milliadores in Galatea. The great fact emerges that after that historic date, all holographs so far exhumed, initialed by Humphrey, bear the sigla HCE. And while he was only in long and always good Duke Humphrey for the younger lay and spalpeens of Luke Lizard, and chimbers to his cronies, it was equally certainly a pleasant turn of the populace which gave him a sense of those normative letters, the nickname, Here Comes Everybody. An imposing everybody he always indeed looked, constantly the same as and equal to himself, and magnificently well worthy of any and all such universalization every time he continually surveyed, amid vociferatings from in front of, except these few nutties, and take off that white hat, relieved with stop his grog, and put it in the log, and loots in his basmoko boots. From good start to happy finish, the truly Catholic assemblage gathered together in that king's treat house, of satin a lustre-like above floats and footlights, from their ass-ball velts and ox gangs, unanimously to clap-plod, the inspiration of his lifetime and the hits of their careers, Mr. Wallenstein Washington Semper Kelly's Immigrant Tours in a command performance, by special request, with the courteous permission for pious purposes, the humdrum and enliveneth performance of problem passion play of the millenary, running strong since creation, a royal divorce. Then near the approach towards the summit of its climax, with ambitious interval bound selections from the Bow Girl and the Lily, an all horsery show, command knights from his vice-regal booth, his Barcelona is sealing there a cuckoo spit less eminent than the red ritual hoods of McCabe and Cullen, where a veritable Napoleon the Nth, our world stages practical joke piece and retired Celtic comedian in his own wise, this folk's forefather all of the time sat, having the entirety of his house about him, with the invariable broad-striped kerchief, cooling his whole neck, nape, and shoulder blades, and in a wardrobe panel tuxedo completely thrown back from a shirt well entitled a Swallow All, on every point far out starching the laundered claw hammers and marble-topped highboys of the pit stalls and early amphitheatre. The piece was this. Look at the lamps. The cast was thus. See under the clock. Ladies' circle, cloaks may be left. Pit, promenade, and parterre, standing room only. Habituals conspicuously emergent. A baser meaning has been read into these characters, the literal sense of which decency can safely scarcely hint. It has been blurtingly bruited by certain wisecrackers. The stinks of Mahomet are in the night plots of the morning, that he suffered from a vile disease, atma unmanable. To such a suggestion, the one self-respecting answer is to affirm that there are certain statements which ought not to be, and one should like to hope to be able to add, ought not to be allowed to be made. Nor have his detractors, who, an imperfectly warm-blooded race, apparently conceive him as a great white caterpillar, capable of any and every enormity in the calendar, recorded to the discredit of the Duke and Kellicock families, mended their case by insinuating that alternately he lay at one time under the ludicrous imputation of annoying Welsh Fusiliers in the People's Park. Hey, 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 hook, 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 Fawn in Florida, on the lee of that little chuck. To anyone who knew and loved the Christ-likeness of the big, clean-minded giant H.C. Earwicker throughout his excellency long vice-fregal existence, the mere suggestion of him as a lust sleuth nosing for trouble in a booby trap rings particularly preposterous. Truth, beard on prophet, compels one to add that there is said to have been Juandam Some case of the kind implicating, it is interred and believed, a quidam. If he did not exist, it would be necessary quonium to invent him. About that time, stambling around Dumbling and leaky sneakers with his dark record, who has remained top-handedly anonymous, but let us Hugham Abdullah Gamanek Saxby was, it is stated, posted at Malins at the instance of watch warriors of the Vigilance Committee, and years afterwards cries one even greater, Ibid, a commender of the frightful seemingly, unto such as were sullen sated, tropped head, piat, who waiting his first of the month fruits, turn for that chop-pack cabbage and licky boy on the old house for the church arm, roast haddocks off of Harkin Street, lob the blondie liar gob, see you in the marketplace, and cheese would eat at their home to fire these boys. There's a cab full of bash indeed in the home you're of that meal. Slander. Let it lie its flattest. Has never been able to convict our good and great, no ordinary southern air wicker, that homogeneous man, as a pious author called him, of any graver impropriety than that advanced by some Woodwards or regarders who did not dare deny the shoulders that they had chin ted, chin tam, chin taffed, consumed the soul of the corn, of having behaved with ungentlemanski immodus opposite a pair of dainty maidservants in the swooth of the rushy hollow, whither, or so the two gown and pinners pleaded, Dame Nature in all innocency had spontaneously at about the same hour of the eventide sent them both, but whose published combinations of silk and lame testimonies are not dubiously pure, visibly divergent, as wapped from wept, on minor points touching the intimate nature of this, a first offence in vert or venison, which was admittedly an incautious, but at its widest, a partial exposure, with such attenuating circumstances, Garth and Gadith Green were soap and brideth Girlin, and abnormal saints within summer, and Jesus Rosh Hashanah, a ripe occasion to provoke it.
That was my friend and colleague Richard Harte reading the opening of Chapter 2 from Finnegans Wake, pages 30 to 34, recorded with a live audience at Noonan's Irish Pub in Toronto on June 26, 2023. Join us in 2 weeks for Episode 8 when Richard continues Finnegans Wake Chapter 2, in which HC Earwicker encounters the Cad in Phoenix Park. To be sure you don't miss any episodes, why not follow or subscribe to this podcast? For more on One Little Goat's Finnegans Wake project, including transcripts of this podcast and trailers for the films, visit our website at onelittlegoat.org. And to hear about upcoming performances and screenings, join our mailing list, also at onelittlegoat.org. Finnegans Wake is made possible by friends of One Little Goat Theatre Company and the Emigrant Support Programme of the Government of Ireland. Thank you for your support. And thank you to the artists for this episode: Richard Harte, sound by William Bembridge, podcast production by Sean Rasmussen, stage management by Jobina Sitoh, directed by yours truly, Adam Seelig. A big thanks to Jane Noonan and the staff at Noonan's Irish Pub, as well as to our wonderful live audience. Thank you to everyone at the Irish Consulate in Toronto, and to production consultants Cathy Murphy and Andrew Moodie. One Little Goat Theatre Company is a non-profit, artist-driven, registered charity. To donate or to find out more or to join our mailing list, please visit www.onelittlegoat.org. Thank you for listening.